So we're picking right back up where we left off on the last video talking about sleep in non-human animals. And so we are going to basically go through a bunch of different groups of organisms to talk about if we have seen sleep in certain ones or not, or if they've met our behavioral criteria of sleep. So just starting out, very, very basic in simple organisms. So we have more than 400,000 unicellular species, but there doesn't seem to be any claim of sleep occurring in these unicellular organisms, including like dinoflagellates and all of different kinds of bacteria, protists, things like that. But what's interesting is that we have seen evidence of circadian rhythm activity. And there's some really interesting videos, if you look on YouTube, of different bodies of water that has, for example, dinoflagellates in it. And it's a really interesting experience to see these at night where you can actually see like dark water. And some of this occurs like in areas of California when it's like sort of in season. Dinoflagellates will actually light up a really, really pretty blue color in the water if you disturb the area. And so we've definitely seen circadian rhythm activity that is affected by exposure to daylight, but doesn't seem to have any evidence specifically of sleep, especially considering our three criteria for behavioral sleep. We've also looked at insects. So, of course, there's over 700,000 insect species. There doesn't seem to be any claims of REM sleep or rapid eye movement sleep when it comes to insects. However, we do know that certain insects, for example, cockroaches, bees, and scorpions, do have quiescent behaviors. So it doesn't quite match the same exact kind of criteria that we're looking for in terms of sort of regular, subjective human sleep. But we do see some very interesting quiescent behaviors. Fruit flies, the Drosophila, very interesting species, something that we study a lot in sleep when it comes to circadian and sleep because we're able to sort of map the whole genome of the fruit fly. We actually do see a behavioral state that satisfies all of our behavioral criteria of sleep. But the question comes in is this the same type of sleep that humans experience? Because, we have very different nervous systems than the fruit fly. And so it begs the question is, even though it meets this behavioral criteria, is the same experience as, we would see in mammalian sleep or even further into human sleep. So I do think it's very interesting. And the Drosophila is a very, very heavily studied species when it comes to sleep and circadian rhythms because there's a lot of really interesting genetic conclusions that we can make when we have, so much information on changing genes and what that affects for this sleep cycle or this circadian cycle compared to others. Moving on to fish, there's more than 30,000 species of fish, but fewer than 10 have been examined for any kind of rest or sleep behaviors, specifically in lab studies. One of the most commonly studied fish when it comes to circadian rhythms is the zebrafish. And so zebrafish, we do see have some circadian variations in terms of responsiveness and activity, as well as decreased responses to stimuli after the sleep have been deprived. However, it's really difficult to know for sure if our process of sleep deprivation is actually working. We've looked at this specifically in perch. And so even though we do see some, if you take a perch, for example, and you reduce their sleeping behaviors or attempt to maybe stimulate them or, do something in the lab to try to get them to remain awake, we do see that they seem to have a rebound effect where they have an increase in rest behavior. So that is moving toward our behavioral criteria of saying, okay, well, if you deprive in this organism of rest, that they do need more rest in response to that. So it's like it could be homeostatically regulated. But one sort of downside is that one of the ways to deprive fish of sleep or rest is using light. And light in of itself could stimulate the animal stimulate the organism in such a way that could be counter effective to what we're trying to do. So one thing that we have to keep in mind is the way that we think that a mammal would respond to, being kept awake versus a fish versus a bird. All of these things have to be considered, and I think that we really do have to question our methodology here and if it's appropriate, and how would you keep a fish awake, right? How would you keep fish awake? So there are some questions here in terms of methodology, but there does seem to be some indication that there is a homeostatic regulation in terms of rest here. Amphibians, okay, we have more than 6,000 amphibian species. Some really, really interesting questions here. So we know that frogs have abilities to, rest in a way and go into torpor and go into different kinds in hibernation and go into different kind of rest states. There's this particular YouTube video here, and it's listed on the Blackboard page, and I really, really want you to go in and explore this. It is the most fascinating video. Basically, just, to sum it up, it basically shows a particular a species of frog that will freeze completely solid for a period of sometimes weeks, and then thaw out as the season changes, and then start to walk around again and hop around again. And so it's really interesting to see these kinds of sort of suspended states. But the question is, during the suspended state, is it really sleep? It doesn't satisfy the behavioral criteria in the sense that it's easily reversible, because if they're frozen solid, then they can't, reverse out of that state very easily. They're immobile, and they're, stuck for many times hours until they can thaw out completely. But, do they sleep during this state? That's a really, really interesting question that we don't have an answer to. And just to generally, do frogs sleep? And it turns out that there's evidence that tree frogs do in fact sleep, but it doesn't seem to have any evidence of REM or rapid eye movement sleep. And we're going to see this a lot with other animals as well, where they do meet the behavioral criteria, our three criteria of sleep, but they're just not sleeping in the same way, or they don't have the same cycles or stages or types that mammals or humans have. And so it's important to note that that should not be something that sort of disqualifies an animal for sleeping just because that sleep might be different. In the case of some animals, rapid eye movement sleep just simply is not conducive to survival. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we get to marine mammals. Moving on with other kinds of frogs. So there's a very interesting study that I've got posted in the Blackboard page about the bullfrog. Now, one interesting thing about the bullfrog is that when they're tested, and there's a very specific study that was done it was published in 1967, so the study was done in the 1960s. They published this study, and it's the only study that really talks about potential of sleep in bullfrogs. Okay, it's interesting because the authors actually suggest that because bullfrogs are actually more responsive to stimulation during their inactive state, that they don't sleep. That bullfrogs simply must not sleep, because during their restful state, it's completely counterintuitive, and bullfrogs are actually more responsive. And so they suggest that bullfrogs are able to survive because they're able to rest without any loss of vigilance, which again is very counterintuitive. And we don't really see this in other species and see this in other animals. So, should we base our entire conclusion that bullfrogs don't sleep on one study done in 1967? Probably not. There really needs to be replication. This is one problem with studying so few species, not only within their own, within the own organisms family tree, but also across different species, thinking about what kind of conclusions are we making about particular animals, and do we have enough evidence and enough study and enough replication to then make an absolute conclusion. So if you have one study on a bullfrog and you say, hey, these animals don't sleep, I would really argue against that is actually true. Also, if I were to, for example, put on a test, like what is the one animal that scientists claim don't sleep? Bullfrogs would certainly be the answer to that. But I would argue that that's probably not the case. One interesting thing that is a problem in this particular study, and then the study done in 1967, and this study is in fact on Blackboard. You can read it. It's a really interesting read. There were some really, really questionable interpretation issues of those respiratory responses because shocks were delivered during the rest state. And so there seems to be some really interesting kind of potentially problematic interpretation issues that could lead one to have the wrong conclusion about bullfrogs in general. So I would encourage you to read this study from 1967 and to, come to your own conclusions. But if I had to guess, I would say that this is probably needs further study. And these studies with different animals certainly need more replication of other bullfrogs. Moving on to reptiles, we have more than 8,000 reptile species. There seems to be a lot of conflicting reports about the potential of REM sleep in reptiles. One thing that's kind of interesting and kind of funny, there's a sort of a push to some scientists say, well, there's REM, that reptiles experience REM, but they don't have the eye movements and they don't have the atonia or the, muscle paralysis during REM. Those are kind of what defines REM sleep, right? Those are two of the more defining qualities of REM sleep. And so I would argue then if we're defining, how are we going to define REM sleep if it is in fact not having the back and forth eye movements and not having the atonia. The question comes into, are these REM sleep episodes adequately distinguished from waking? As we talk about different sleep types and stages, we know that looking at REM electrical brain activity compared to waking actually looks very, very similar, which is why REM is referred to as paradoxical sleep. But do we have enough study in reptiles to say, yes, this is this is in fact REM, or is it a different rest state completely? And I don't think we just have enough evidence quite yet for that. Turtles also have a really interesting story here. So we do see some behavioral quiescence. We see this kind of accompanied by a reduction in responses as well as an increase in response latency. We see that after scientists disrupt the quiescent state, we see an increase in brain activity, but we don't see necessarily the slow waves in the forebrain that we typically see in sleep. So we don't typically see this kind of deep slow wave sleep. And we do generally see in these rest states sort of reduction in neuronal activity and general activity, which would lead us to believe that there's some sleep or version of sleep beyond behavioral, behind just a quiescent state that is going on here. But again, there's not a lot of study in reptiles. There's not a lot of studies in animals in general, and reptiles in general with sleep. So have to be very careful about our conclusions. Birds are very interesting. This is some of my favorite work done in birds. We have more than 10,000 species, and we do see that birds have indications of both REM and non-REM sleep. And we can actually define these with electrographic criteria, looking at their brains and the electrical activity in that. They do experience REM, but tends to be much shorter than mammals. Here's an example of a white-crowned sparrow where we've have quite a bit of work on this. And what's really interesting with the white-crowned sparrow is that when the bird is caged during migration season, we see that their sleep is reduced 2/3. Now, even when they're not migrating, even when they're caged and they should be migrating, we see this reduction in sleep, which is very interesting because they're not behaviorally engaging in migration. However, they're still seasonally affected by a migration season. Their sleep is affected by that. Now, even though they're getting much reduced sleep, it doesn't seem to impact them in a way that would look like sleep deprivation. So we don't see reduction in accuracy. We don't see any reduction in performance in tasks. So that coupled with the lack of sleep rebound needed tells us that they've adapted and evolved a way to survive quote unquote the normal state. So they're normal, right? Is this 2/3 reduced sleep during this period of time. So they are adapted to surviving with less sleep and not having the effects that we would typically see with a sleep reduction outside of, or sleep deprivation outside of migration seasons. We also see that when we deprive sparrows of sleep, we don't see the same kind of pathologies that we're seeing in sleep deprived rats. They just seem to be better adapted to be able to sleep. We also know that sleep in birds is different because they sleep one hemisphere at a time. And so, we have basically two hemispheres in our cortex, and birds are able to sleep while migrating. They're able to sleep while flying with sort of one hemisphere alert and one hemisphere asleep. And so, very interesting sleep patterns. We're going to talk a little bit more about hemispheric sleep when we get to dolphins. But that's a really interesting kind of way to sleep, and again, a way to evolve being able to be active without sacrificing vulnerability and sacrificing the time that they need to take to migrate. Now, one interesting thing about mammals, land mammals, so we have, over 4,000 mammalian species, lots and lots and lots of studies of domesticated species, right? So we have tons of studies on rats, mice, cats, dogs, monkeys, tons of studies on these, especially rats, lots of study on cats when it comes to looking at brainstem and involvement and potentially of awareness states and dream states, and then a lot of work in dogs because there's been findings in specific genetic links to narcolepsy. And so we have a whole line of basically narcoleptic dogs where we can study the genetics and development of narcolepsy. All of these domesticated species, of course, have meet that conventional definition of sleep. So check on all the behavioral criteria. The problem that we get to, especially in the non-domesticated group, is the fact that we don't have as many sleep studies of animals in their naturalistic conditions. So one thing, for example, when looking at elephants, like and other large herbivores, we can look at them at the zoo, right? But when they're in the zoo, they have a constant food supply, right? There's no predator threats. They don't migrate. They don't have the same span of territory that they typically might have. So even though they might be in a zoo setting and they have a lot of space, it's not near the amount of mileage that they may typically have if they were in their natural habitat. And so because of that, it is most definitely impacting their sleep, and it's definitely something that we're not going to be able to necessarily get a good eye on unless we are actually looking at animals in their naturalistic setting. So there's a lot of limitations to studying animals that are domesticated and animals that are also like in a habitat or in the zoo or in even a conservation, because it's not the same thing that you would typically see in their naturalistic environment. The conditions aren't the same. And so, again, a lot of limitations in terms of generalizability for these kinds of studies. And just in general, the properties of sleep vary substantially across species. We might see, one species, like a large cat, getting something like 18 hours of sleep per day, whereas we see much smaller animals getting something like, 4 hours per day, or even some, larger animals might not get that much sleep in relation to other animals their size. It depends on how many predators they have, the time of day that they are awake versus asleep. So it might be that you have nocturnal animals because there's less predators in the evening. So the patterns of sleep and the amount of sleep vary very substantially across different kinds of animals for many different reasons. The next and final group that we're going to talk about are marine mammals. So we have more than 100 marine mammal species. I've kind of split this up into Otariidae, which would be like the fur seal and the sea lion, and cetaceans. Excuse me. So Otariidae, are on both land and water. And so their sleep actually differs if they are on land versus in the water. When they're on land, we see that the both of their hemispheres, both brain hemispheres, are bilaterally synchronized. Um, and so, meaning that they're sleeping at the same time, right? They're like humans would sleep in a way that is that both hemispheres are asleep at the same time. They also, just like very much like humans, they cycle through REM and non-REM sleep. So when they're on land, so like here, they spend some of their time on land, and then they will spend some of their times in the water, and they might spend hours at a time in the water. We do see a different pattern. So first, we see this sort of interesting asymmetrical pattern of behavior, where it's a consequence of sleeping one hemisphere at a time. So we see slow wave sleep in one hemisphere, and the contralateral eye is closed, and then it rotates. And then the other hemisphere will then become alert, and then the opposing hemisphere will then fall asleep, and then the other eye will open and the other eye will close. And so typically, because of one hemisphere working at a time, we see one flipper active at a time. We also see that the REM sleep is greatly reduced, if almost non-existent. But then when it doesn't seem to be that when they're in the water, that lack of REM sleep necessarily affects them. So kind of like how we talk about birds and sort of adapting to having a reduction in sleep during the migratory period in the season. It seems to be that the Otariidae group seems to be adapted and evolved, that when they're in the sleep, there is no rebound needed. So it's not like they jump into REM immediately when they hit the land, and are able to sleep. They're able to not have to undergo extra REM when they're on land. So very interesting way to evolve their sleep. Now, cetaceans, which include things like bottlenose dolphin, beluga whales, also show unihemispheric sleep, but only show unihemispheric sleep. So they are not, because they're in the water all of the time, they don't have the privilege or luxury of being able to have REM and not sink. So if a dolphin, for example, were to go into REM sleep, they would go into the atonia, and their muscles would paralyze. And because they have to stay constantly active in the water, and they also need to come up for air, if they start sinking, then they would die. And so dolphins, for example, and other cetaceans do not show REM sleep. They only show the slow wave sleep, and they only show it one hemisphere at a time. They don't seem to ever show any kind of bilateral high voltage, which would indicate something like REM. Now, when they are in slow wave sleep, they may float, but usually they do swim in some way. But they don't have this same kind of asymmetry that we see in the Otariidae. They don't seem to have, one flipper going at a time. They seem to have symmetrical motor activity, but they might circle a bit. And depending on where they are in the world, may kind of circle different ways, but typically we see this counterclockwise direction. And I have a really interesting dolphin study on Blackboard for you guys to take a look at, which is a really interesting argument of how do dolphins, which way do they turn when they're sleeping versus, a Western hemisphere versus, or northern versus southern hemisphere. It's a very interesting take on that. So here's a really interesting set of pictures. So just kind of further demonstrating dolphins. So this is an example of a dolphin brain kind of split front ways. Here you can see that EEG action, where you see the left brain here changing then to would be alert, and this would be a switch to slow wave sleep. And then here you see that is just then a switch. So there's a full switch here. And they don't actually have to transition into like a transitory stage if they're already one hemisphere asleep. So here you can see there's a beluga whale. Here's the EEG as well. And you can see that nice shift into sleep from one hemisphere at a time. And then here you can see a rat. You don't see that hemispheric sleep here. You see that the rat's hemispheres are symmetrical or synchronized. So it's a nice difference between a beluga whale versus a rat. So really interesting differences there. And then here's just a really simple kind of demonstration that's like a little bit more normalized, like easier to kind of see here. So here we have the dolphin is awake, right? So both their left and their right hemispheres are in an active state. And then intermediate sleep is this transition into sleep. So their right hemisphere is transitioning into sleep. The left hemisphere is remaining awake. So it moves from intermediate sleep to this slow wave sleep. Again, the left hemisphere is remaining awake, and then we see the shift. So then right goes into waking, and then left moves into the slow wave sleep. But you see that we don't need to go back to this intermediate sleep. It immediately transitions into slow wave. Very similar to how we would see, for example, when humans sleep. They don't necessarily have to move back to stage one, that non-REM transition period. When it comes to other cetaceans, there seems to be some conflicting evidence about sleep deprivation and activity after deprivation. There's a lot of really weird exceptions to the sleep rules that we've kind of figured out for cetaceans. One thing that we can't really explain very well is newborn dolphins and newborn killer whales. 4 to 6 weeks after birth, they're active continuously, and it kind of looks like they don't sleep at all, and that certainly doesn't seem to be. It doesn't seem to have a good explanation. We don't seem to have a good explanation of why an animal or how an animal can be continuously active so soon after birth. But there's sort of a debate there. Are they sleeping for 4 to 6 weeks after birth, or what are they doing? Other smaller cetaceans seem to be continuously active throughout their life. They don't ever float. They don't ever sink to the bottom. They don't seem to ever remain completely still. And so there's some argument of like, are they engaging in any rest or sleep? How does that work for that particular organism? So just finishing up here, and just, kind of wrapping up with some of these conclusions, things to consider. So number one, do we need to change our definition of sleep when looking at so many different organisms? And we've kind of acknowledged that even mammals, for example, have very different patterns. Other organisms may have REM or, may not have an indication of REM. Does that matter? Should we broaden our definition? Should we narrow our definition? Because looking at all these different organisms, there's so many different types of ways they're sleeping, and even debatable if we would even qualify it as sleep. So I think that, we always need to question our definition and ask, is this suitable for the animals that we've studied? And I think that, that we still need a lot more study before we know for sure. Another thing to point to consider is that we always have to be cautious whenever we're making any kind of conclusions about sleep in different organisms, because most of the studies that we've done have not been exhaustive. If you're not going to repeat the same study of the same species, then you can't really safely conclude that an animal does or does not sleep. Same point in case is the bullfrog. One study from 1967 with questionable methodology. Now we say, okay, well, the bullfrog doesn't sleep. Well, can we make that conclusion? We've got one study of a group of scientists that suggests that. It's not an exhaustive study of the species. It's, not even a replicated study. Should we make those kinds of conclusions? And I think that we should not. Even if we have, multiple studies, we should really be questioning those results and looking at pattern across and make sure that they're all consistent. And I think ultimately what this leads us to is that we just need more research, much more research on different capacities, looking at sleep in vertebrates and even invertebrates, just trying to understand, what does rest states look like? Do we, are categories of quiescence and torpor and hibernation, should we expand on that? Should there be different categories within those? Do we have a separate set of category of sleep? Should we have variations of that? So I think ultimately we have to ask those questions, and we have to be very mindful of what we're studying and how many replications that we have of those particular studies. But hopefully you found this very interesting. This is always one of my favorite areas to cover because it's just so broad and so many neat things to discover beyond our own sleep. So have a wonderful time, and hopefully you had a good time.